Hello, and welcome to this session on animal advocacy in a global context with Marianne van der Werf. I'm Habiba Islam, and I'll be the MC for this session. We'll be starting with a 15-minute talk by Marianne, then we'll move on to a live Q&A session where she'll respond to your questions. You can submit questions in your name or anonymously using the box to the right-hand side of this video. You can also vote for your favorite questions to push them higher up the queue. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Then after 20 minutes of questions, I'll bring the Q&A to an end. But that's not the end of the session. To help you think through and apply the ideas you've heard, I'll be asking you to join a 20-minute icebreaker session where you'll have 2 speed meetings with other attendees to discuss your thoughts on the context and the content. I'll explain how to do that when we get there. But now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Marianne van der Werf is Programme Officer for the Effective Animal Advocacy Fund at Animal Charity Evaluators. She's committed to reducing the worst form of suffering for all sentient beings. She's been involved in effective altruism and animal advocacy since 2015, and she's worked with a few different EA organisations before joining Animal Charity Evaluators in 2019. Marianne is excited to contribute to the animal advocacy movement by identifying promising funding opportunities. Here's Marianne.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. My name is Marianne van der Werf. I'm with Animal Charity Evaluators. Personally, I've been involved in the effective altruism community and the animal advocacy community over the past 5 years. And thank you for coming to today's talk about international animal advocacy. Animal advocacy is a global issue. Animals are suffering all over the world, and therefore it requires global solutions and a global scope. Most organizations and most funding, however, in the movement are located in North America and in Western Europe. So this talk will discuss how we can work effectively to contribute to a more equitable distribution of these resources and what ACE sees as the best approaches to this topic. ACE sees this as a global issue, but we do have mostly a US lens. This means that we're registered in the US and most of our employees are from the US. So this also means that most of our connections and context is in the US. We do have employees from different countries, but usually because we just have one or maybe 2 people from these countries, it's hard to have the same type of disagreements and discussions like we can have about the US context. At ACE we do different things, but the regions of our work or the areas of our work that are most relevant to today's topic are the charity evaluations, which is why we are called Animal Charity Evaluators. At this project, we start with a long list of charities and we narrow it down to a list to evaluate in depth. And this year we aim to evaluate 15 charities. We also have the EA fund, which I run. And here all charities can apply for funding. And usually these are smaller organizations that are less well funded than the charities that we evaluate. And all charities can apply for the EA fund, and we will read and review and discuss who will receive a grant. 2 questions that come up a lot in our work are how can we evaluate charities in countries that are outside of our region that we know a lot about. This is relevant to our evaluations and our grant decisions, and also for those in the audience who may not be working at a research organization that recommends animal charities. It is interesting if you want to support charities outside of your own country through your personal donations. The second question is, how do we evaluate how organizations are doing international expansion? So for example, if we are, during our evaluations, if we are evaluating a charity based in the US, but that has daughter organizations or subsidiaries in maybe the UK or Germany or India or Brazil, how do we evaluate, like, what are the best practices? How can we tell whether they're doing a good job? And these are questions that are also relevant to people who may want to start their own charity in a different country than where they're from, or people who want to donate to a US headquartered organization who may be expanding internationally, or to any other organization who is expanding internationally. I'll briefly discuss how we evaluate countries that are outside of our expertise. So we do a lot of research. So that is one thing that we do. We have country reports for India, China, and Brazil. And those are very in-depth country reports. We also have roundtable blog posts where we invite people to talk about animal advocacy in their country. And we also rely on the research that others have done, of course. Another thing that we do is we ask charities and animal advocates who are in our network how they perceive a specific approach or a specific charity in their region. So this covers how we look into countries that are outside of our region of expertise. Let's discuss now how we can evaluate charities that expand internationally. And first, let's discuss reasons why charities may want to do this. So we already discussed that their animals are suffering all over the world. So how we prioritize where we're doing our work, that is very important. So because it's an EA talk, I'm going to talk about scope and neglectedness. For those who are not familiar with these terms, scope basically means the size of the problem. And because there are different countries, and in different countries more or fewer animals are being killed for food, the scope of the problem or the size of the problem differs per country. Another way why the scope matters is, how the scope matters is there could be fewer or more regulations protecting these animals from suffering, which could mean that the scope of their suffering is larger or smaller. Neglectedness means basically how many resources are going into the problem. If there are not so many resources going into the problem is very neglected. So this also differs per country, like we discussed before. Even though animal advocacy is very much neglected everywhere in the world, in North America and in Western Europe, we do have NGOs and organizations with tens and sometimes over 100 people working full-time on these issues, which is really great. But in other regions, there are not these large organizations. So there is a potential for low-hanging fruit there. So there are very good reasons for why organizations may want to expand internationally, but there are also risks involved. If an organization with a large budget wants to expand to a country where the animal advocacy movement doesn't have the same amount of resources, it can be good to share these resources with this new region, but it can also pose a risk because they can have a big influence on how the movement in that country develops and how it is perceived. And there's a real risk of doing harm. If me as a Dutch person would have a successful vegan snacks company in the Netherlands, these may be the snacks that I would sell. The Dutch people in the audience may recognize the frikandel, which me and my friends when I was a kid were very suspicious of because we heard there were horses in it. And we also see the bami-schijf, which is the Dutch interpretation of Indonesian cuisine. So these snacks would do well in the Netherlands, but if I wanted to expand to the United States, people may not have the same appreciation for these snacks. And my company may just make not so much money, so that wouldn't be an issue. I would just have a neutral impact, except for my own investments in it. But if I had a lot of money, I could, and a lot of resources, I could push a very aggressive frikandel ad campaign. And this may have a negative impact, as people in the US may perceive veganism as that annoying woman who tries to push frikandellen in the United States. How animals are treated and what kind of foods we eat, those are very much tied to culture. So naturally, they are a very sensitive topic already. And this is especially the case for countries that have been colonized by Western countries, for example, India. Here people will have, understandably, a very large distrust of Western groups coming in and aiming to change the culture. There is an example of Varda Mehrotra, who is executive director of Yapo, who is an A standard charity in India. And she gives the example of in South India, in the state of Tamil Nadu, there is a practice called Jallikattu, which is a form of bullfighting. And the Supreme Court ruled that this practice should be banned, and obviously that received opposition from people who wanted to keep the practice. And because this involvement of an Indian branch of a US organization, the people who wanted to keep the bullfighting were able to frame the animal advocacy campaigns as Western organizations looking to destroy the Tamilian culture. This example is in India, but they are relevant to countries all over the world. Another example is China, as in which you may know the political system there requires a lot of sensitivity. And doing the wrong thing can not only harm the movement there, but also endanger people who are working on veganism in that country. It's easy to have a negative impact when we don't fully understand the local context. There are some ways to mitigate these risks, which we can do by following what ACE considers to be best practices. The first of these is to aim to support the local movement. If you are coming in as a country with more resources in the animal advocacy movement, aim to support the local movement of the new region where you're moving into and not try to lead it. We believe that the most effective way to help animals is not necessarily the one that promotes your own organization the most. We believe that supporting the local movement is more sustainable in the long term, and certainly less risky. This involves listening and learning from local advocates and understanding why they chose the campaigns that they do and how your resources can support them. And these resources can include funding, strategic advising, expertise on specific disciplines. One initiative that does this very well is the Open Wing Alliance, which is a part of the Humane League, who is also an ACE top charity. The Open Wing Alliance is a coalition of small groups, and they all work on cage-free campaigns all over the world. And they provide, the Open Wing Alliance provides grants and also trainings to these organizations. So this is a great example of how you can support the local movement, different movements over the world as a US-based organization. A second best practice is to adapt your approach. This includes reconsidering the assumptions that you're making that are maybe underlying the campaigns that you're doing in your main region, and see if they also hold up for the new region. One of such assumption is the context of groups of animals in this region. Cuisines really differ all over the world, and so do the types of animals who are unfortunately being farmed and consumed. One example of this is the number of goats killed. So for example, in the United States, there are 10 times fewer goats killed as there are cows being killed. So we may imagine that a campaign focusing on goats in the United States may not be perceived as a traditionally effective animal advocacy campaign just because of the number of animals impacted. But in the rest of the world, in different countries, there may be many more goats killed. Globally, around twice as many goats are being killed as cows. Adapting your approach also means changing your goals, updating your goals, and don't just copy a successful campaign that worked in your main region, but adapt them to the context of a new region. Anima International works very collaboratively with campaigns. Anima International is also an A-stop charity. They work very collaboratively with local groups in different countries. They decide the names of the campaigns and the branding together with the local advocates. And they also help local advocates by sharing what type of strategies work in different countries. So they don't impose these strategies, but they will explain it to them how these strategies in other countries work, so the local advocates can adapt them to their own context. One example of this that they mention in our roundtable blog post is how the English language is perceived. So for some campaigns in some countries, in some regions, it may be good to have an English language name of your campaign because it's associated with being modern and cosmopolitan, but in other regions it may be perceived as something foreign that is being imposed on the country. So as a summary of the things that we discussed today, if you want to support organizations in a different country, it could be very helpful to do research in the local context. If you want to expand your organization to a different country, I would recommend to support the local movement and not aim to lead the local movement, and also to reconsider your assumptions that worked in a different country. Some other relevant resources on this topic are animal charity evaluators country reports. We have for Brazil, China, and for India. We also have a roundtable blog post on international expansion. And I would also recommend Charity Entrepreneurship's country prioritization report on how they prioritize countries for their own projects. Thank you so much for your attention. I want to say the EA Fund, which I mentioned before, is having open applications still until next week, June 18th. And here's my email address, mariana@animalcharity-evaluators.org. Thank you all for coming, and let me know if you have any questions or if you want to discuss these topics further.
Thank you for that talk, Marianne. I see we've already had a number of questions submitted on Slido, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Do keep those coming in. First of all, I just wanted to give you a chance to explain the difference between the EEA Fund and the other charities that ACE reviews.
Yeah, so ACE reviews charities very in depth for our charity recommendations. And we do this, this involves a lot of communication with the charities and the leadership, and getting very in-depth information. And this takes the research team a couple months. And the EA Fund is more for smaller charities that are less established, that may not have as much of a track record. So that also involves a less in-depth research process. So our aim with our charity evaluations that we have once a year is to really find the best. I'm sorry for my bird. For my there another one goes. Is to identify the most promising charities, and usually those are also the ones the most promising ones to donate to. So they also need to have a lot of room for more funding. So that is why those are usually more established charities, and they have a larger budget, so they can absorb more funding. And the EA Fund is to complement those, because if we usually our recommended charities, they have they're like similar and they're large, and usually when they have like it's kind of stable, like the ones that we recommend. They're kind of somewhat similar work. although there are, of course, large variations between them. And the EAA fund is more to also be able to support other kinds of work, because we don't believe that just the 4 that we recommend are necessarily the only charities that people should support. So the EA fund is more to give other charities and other approaches an opportunity to also develop and maybe be recommended as top charities in the future.
So we've had a lot of questions around research methodology and how you approach evaluating charities. And so feel free to draw a distinction between how charities are evaluated for the EAA fund and how for ACE's like reviews. So just jumping in with our top rated question, we've had the question is, how do you rate sentientness for each living being in your research? And is this used as a weighted factor for specific policy changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's also a very difficult topic. I think it's not one of the main considerations in our work. I think what this question means is that a different species may have a different capacity for having experiences. So some species of animals may be able to suffer more or suffer less. So maybe they have more pain receptors, or maybe they cannot have, they don't have like complicated feelings such as jealousy or those types of feelings that more complex species may have. And so that is also a consideration for which groups of animals or which species to focus on. And I think it is so difficult to make those distinctions. And personally, I think also a lot of speciesism can be involved there when we think, for example, that insects may have fewer capacity for welfare than, or less capacity for suffering or welfare than humans or pigs or other larger animals that we may identify better. So I think that's a real risk. I think so. When we are making decisions on what charities or what approaches to focus on, we do find there are not so many projects that are working on invertebrates. So I don't think it is really a question of like that we have equal projects for every species and that we need to decide between those two. Usually the considerations are more like, what do we think that this project will, what will the impact be in the future? And if that is focused on invertebrates, then the question would be more about like moral circle expansion and having more considerations for invertebrates in the future, so we can do more research and fully understand these individuals in the future.
Okay, yeah, a complicated question. Another kind of question about how you do the review process. How do you trade off, i.e. prioritize funding between capacity building against direct work in countries where animal advocacy community is small or new?
Yeah, that's also a good question. We've been thinking about how we would like to, like what we see as the best approach to developing or growing the animal advocacy in a specific region. I think for the EAA fund, we do like to focus more on capacity building. For example, we would find it compelling if an organization wants to have a campaign on something that is not directly in ACE's cost area. So that could be like circus animals or fur or something that would not be something that ACE prioritizes directly, but it would make them able to, it would make the organization be able to build connections with others and build the fundraising and more capacity and skills to move on to other work that would be more in line with ACE's prioritization, for example, focusing on chickens or fishes. In those cases, we would have a preference for if they would focus on the direct work that would also have a bigger direct impact. Or we would, for example, we are very, we do like to fund things that are like hiring a fundraiser or something that is more focusing on the sustainability of a project in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of people picking up on sort of what are the greatest challenges in channeling funds from Northern America and Europe to elsewhere, especially to neglected Asian countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're different things. So one is it is sometimes hard for organizations to accept foreign funding, and organizations may need to have certain permits, or it may not be allowed at all. So these are considerations. There are also considerations that it's difficult for ACE to understand the context of those countries and what is actually the most effective approaches there. And there's also a language barrier, and we so that ACE's work is all in English, and our contacts are mostly English-speaking people. We did translate some of the materials in Spanish, so it would be more accessible for people who primarily speak Spanish to read and to apply for the EA fund. But I would say those are the main challenges.
People also, there's lots of questions around, I guess, trade-offs between, or like trying to rank different types of interventions in this space. So someone's asked, how would you compare, or how should we compare charities that reduce animal farming suffering and charities that promote veganism and plant-based food?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is also really, I think it really depends on the context and what, I don't think I have a specific number in mind, like I would want 60% to be focused on farmed animals, for example. I think some considerations are, what are other people funding and interested in? So I know that for plant-based eating, there are also people who are focused on health and environment who are able to provide funding for initiatives that are related to that. Another consideration is that people are more receptive to those ways for diet change. And I think that also makes sense because, especially for health, because diet is such a personal thing. So it makes sense for it to be like, well, I feel like farmed animals is more like a political thing, or like an improving the world thing. And diet and personal consumption, that may not necessarily be that way, or that may really depend on your views on how economics works, and whether you're buying a Beyond Burger instead of a cow burger, whether that's like what the impact of that is. One consideration that I also find compelling is that people who do eat plant-based for health or environment are more likely to be receptive to the arguments of anti-speciesism and animal welfare. And I think that is also really important. I think how we would have decided that for the EAA funds, it really depends on the context. We have tended not to fund projects that are seeing plant-based eating as like a cure for all diseases or something like that. But I think we would find it promising if it would be about like changing the government's views on what like the government's recommendations for healthy eating, for example, that is more systematic and that doesn't make strong claims about diet and how it relates to health issues.
The worry is the overblown claims sort of being just unreliable. Yeah, it seems like there's just a lot of different hard to make decisions in the area between strategies. Am I right in assuming that one of the reasons why ACE or set up this particular fund is because it's quite hard to to judge these different interventions, and we maybe don't have enough evidence to be able to conclusively say that some things are better than others, and therefore we want to try and have this pluralist type approach to funding different potential strategies?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So some of the reasons why we have, so we see the EA fund as like complementing our recommended charities. So we have the recommended charities that we feel confident that people will, that if they donate to those, that it will be used very well. Some consider, but we don't think that all funding in the movement should go to these small number of charities and small number of approaches. So yes, these questions about like how to weigh health and farmed animal welfare, health advocacy and farmed animal welfare. Yes, those are very good.
Direct work, and one last question on a specific approach. What's the state of wild animal welfare advocacy outside the US and Europe? Do you have a view on this?
I know some organizations are trying to do more global work. I don't have a good view on how it is outside of the US and Europe. But genuinely, yes, I'm excited about the growing of the field of wild animal welfare.
And stepping back a bit, what kinds of someone's asked, what do you think are the most sort of either underrated and overrated strategies in the movement as a whole?
Wow.
Big question.
I think one approach that is underrated, or one approach that is underrated is more like making strong claims or making like very bold animal advocacy protest type stuff. And personally, I think this is because it may be that I would really like to see more like people who have a strong like not use any animals type messaging. I think the welfare improvements and incremental change, I think those are really incremental welfare change, those are really good, and the charities that are the organizations that are doing work in that area are really excellent. But I think for the EA fund, for example, I would really like to be able to have more applicants that have that are very strategic about how they go about that and have these strong claims. So one example would be like getting rights for some non-human animals, or it could be like closing down specific slaughterhouses, or like the general messaging. Personally, I think those would be promising. Or like more like behind the scenes things, like understanding the local politics of things and getting involved and making change for animals there.
And actually, could you give us some examples of some projects in other countries that ACE found particularly interesting and have funded, perhaps in previous rounds?
Yes, we had lots. Yes, I'm very excited about lots of our EA funds grantees. We had a really great project from Vegans of Shanghai, who works on plant-based eating around Shanghai. Esra Animali did a really great work. They are working in Italy, and they have they use their grant for like improving their internal processes, which is something that from the outside you may not see, but I think those are the things that are really key to making the movement more sustainable.
Okay. And there's a full list of the previous fundees on your website, so people can check that out if they want to find out more detail about who's received funding in the past. And just as another plug, there's one more week left to get your fund applications in. And also hello to your bird. What's that one? What's the name?
This is Emily.
Okay, hi Emily. Perfect. Okay, we'll carry on, and maybe she can pitch in with some answers. So just to switch in, as we're just winding up, so we've got about 5 more minutes for questions. So to switch into sort of thinking about this from a kind of careers perspective, a lot of the approaches, someone's pointed out that a lot of the approaches of that you find promising that you want to fund are in kind of comms or branding or international marketing, things like that. And this person has pointed out that those kinds of careers are not are underrepresented by 80,000 hours. I should probably point out I work for 80,000 hours, but so you don't need to feel obliged to hold back any criticism. The question is, do you advocate those careers? Do you think that if people want to potentially to work in this area, that they should be going into these kinds of comms, branding, international marketing type roles?
I don't think I have a good view on that. I know that the organization Animal Advocacy Careers is a new organization that is looking into promising career paths for people in animal advocacy, and like looking into the bottlenecks. I don't think I have a good view on which career paths are which types of careers I would recommend people to go into that I feel like would be confident that they would get a job in animal advocacy. I think it would depend more on the social, on the whether people are good fits, whether they are actually excited about these career paths, and whether the organizations have opportunities or interest in growing into these areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great plug for a new organization that's set up to look at animal careers particularly. And I guess I can chip in and say, as someone who works for 80,000 hours, if you're looking for directed career advice on particularly reducing animal suffering, then like 8,000 hours isn't going to be the best resource for you. And going to this other organization is like going to give you the better targeted, well-researched advice in that area.
I'm also always happy to talk with people about their specific career paths, and if I have anything to contribute to that.
Mm-hmm. One sort of question on future directions of research. So I noted in ACE's kind of career plans or plans for this year, there's a desire to look more into sort of long-termist thought and how that and sort of connect some of the research with the wider EA movement, thinking around that. So someone has asked, have long-termist considerations been through recommendations or evaluations to date?
I think I'm thinking about how I see like the theory of change of our current recommendations. So I think this is more like this is a consideration that comes up for our EA fund more maybe. So maybe I think the problem is that we are not sure about like which different interventions would contribute to long-termist considerations more or less. I think personally, the long-termist considerations of moral circle expansion and just having a more stable. I think if people care about individuals that look different from them or that are different from them, that is a lot more stable situation where people are less biased. And I think speciesism is one of the main concerns that I have for that. I think especially if in situations where technology could have an even much bigger impact on our lives, like what the values that are in that technology are, like if those are very speciesist or very bigoted views, that would be very concerning and could cause a lot of suffering. I don't know which different interventions would contribute to that differently. I think like all interventions that are working towards ending factory farming would work towards moral circle expansion for non-human animals. Some that are more like maybe more on the edge of that is things that are like research into invertebrate sentience or considerations for invertebrates or about suffering in general. Some things that are about spreading anti-speciesist views, and that could be via like getting legal rights for certain species of animals, seeing some species as full persons. That could be one of the things in that. One thing that we wouldn't support is things that are actually promoting high welfare meat. And I think that is because it is, personally, I wouldn't do that because of the negative messaging and the reinforcing of speciesism, which I think could be really harmful for the long term.
What was the thing that said there? I think Emily may have.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
The thing that you wouldn't fund would be?
Projects or initiatives that promote high welfare meat.
Okay. Well, if people have more thoughts about that, they can pick it up in the next session, hopefully, because unfortunately that concludes the Q&A part of this session. Thanks for everyone who sent in questions. Sorry if we didn't get to yours, including a couple about Emily, I'm afraid we didn't have time for. But don't go away just yet. Discussing new ideas with people can be a really good way to understand them. So we're going to use the last 20 odd minutes of this session for a couple of short speed meetings with other attendees. If you check the session description below this video, you'll find a link to an icebreaker session where we're going to be gathering for those meetings. So please click on that link now, and a new host will meet you on the other side.